why don't we go down the row and have each of you kind of introduce yourself, kind of the role that you've played on the different Hyperledger projects to this date, yeah, just start with that, just like 1.5 minutes tops.
Sure. So my name is Dan Middleton, and I work for Intel. But I helped to release the Sawtooth project from Intel into Hyperledger, where we're growing it into a broader and broader community effort and working with some of the other great projects that are in the Hyperledger space, like Burrow and Iroha, for example.
Casey Kuhlman, I work for Monax, and we're responsible for bringing in Burrow into the Hyperledger umbrella, and now we're looking forward to working with Sawtooth and some of the other projects to have sort of a common application engine that can be run across a range of DLTs.
I'm Makoto Takemiya from Sorimitsu. We're in Tokyo. We're a very small fintech company, but we were able to work with the community to introduce Iroha into the framework ecosystem, and we're one of the co-maintainers of Iroha.
Hi, my name's Amber Balday, and I'm the blockchain program lead at JP Morgan. We are also premier members of Hyperledger and also incubate the Quorum stack, which is not yet part of Hyperledger, but always on the table.
Cool. So open source is at the heart of the project, right? And I've been for 20 years kind of like almost taking for granted that people get kind of the value of why somebody would open source a piece of technology. But maybe as you could walk through each of your organizations and talk about kind of your own kind of approach to justifying participation to your bosses around your time in the project, as well as just in general, why a company, it might be obvious for somebody like Intel who's been in open source for a while, but for JP Morgan, who perhaps is more earlier in their kind of journey down this path, what's the value of participating in open source, and is there something particular to blockchain technology that makes that relevant?
Yeah, sure. So I can kick off. So it's really easy discussion at Intel because Intel is a large contributor, in particular to Linux, but across the open source spectrum. So there's not a whole lot of pushback. But when it comes to something like blockchain, where this is a new technology, I think there's a lot of assumptions that companies make about how they can lock up value in having proprietary components, and that often doesn't play out. We find that it's really advantageous just to get a lot of those ideas out there and get adoption for them, and it's through that adoption that ultimately the company succeeds and gets value.
I think that blockchains are fundamentally coordination mechanisms, and if you're going to have a system that is really about collaboration across various companies, it almost requires by definition that it be open source. It doesn't necessarily have to be open source, but I think it is much, much easier if you have a code base that is at a level of the stack where everyone can contribute to it and everyone can see what's happening underneath the hood, and then use that as the engine for collaboration and coordination across the companies when it's moved into a runtime out of development setting.
So let me first say briefly why we created Iroha. So our main use case was mobile applications, and at the time that we started development last summer, there really wasn't any platform that was good at connecting with mobile applications for our use case. So we worked on it first internally, and then we realized early on that we wanted to try to open source it. And it wasn't always part of our initial goal, but we kind of realized that just having this siloed system that only we use doesn't really create a healthy ecosystem. And at the end, distributed ledgers, I think, will all be linked together through common protocols. And so we want to help work with the community and help guide some of that discussion.
Sure. I think at JPM or within the banking industry broadly, it's been a much newer sort of a conversation, as you alluded to. And there's been a lot of conversation at even up to the C-suite level of what is open source and why should we care. And at first, I think there's probably some feeling of, oh, free resources, that's great. Free software, and you have to kind of explain the difference between free as in free speech as in free beer, which always goes well with the C-suite. But over time, I think they understood, and there's probably some garbled analogies that happen in there, or the metaphors that make sense to them. But when it comes to talking about blockchain, The idea of give away the operating system but charge for the apps is something they could understand. If you want everyone to be running the same or similar networks, that's okay. That's not where the secret sauce of the business IP is. That we should all standardize on, and that should be open and foster as much acceleration and innovation as possible. Let's get back to focusing on what we do best, which is implementing actual business processes in financial markets on top of those.
Is it hard to sometimes tell where the line is between operating system and apps? Because there's a lot of gray area sometimes. I mean, arguably, blockchains are apps on top of operating systems below them, right? Where is that?
Sure.
How do you help them figure out where that line is? You think?
I think for a bank specifically, or the work that we're doing right now is protocol level work that they've never dabbled in before. So that there's a very clear line. When we start talking about the way that smart contracts will interoperate on the system, it probably gets a little fuzzier. But I think that we have processes for best practices in architecture and the way that we want the full application stack to be modularized anyway. That would happen whether you're using open source or not. So not trying to reinvent the wheel, but simply trying to reapply the technology best practices that we already have and say this is an emerging technology, but let's treat it just like any other technology that's not new. It's not as hard as you would think. I think in a way, I've actually, we've gotten to the point where we might have oversold open source a little bit. Because now it's like, oh, it's open source, that means it's good, and we should use it. And we have to teach people now that, well, you can open source anything. It doesn't mean that the code is actually better, audited, ready, stronger, right? So it's a balance with people that only interact from a high level to make sure that they're engaged and they want to participate and they understand the importance of an ecosystem, but at the same time they understand that comes with some risk and requires a new way of engaging with the developer community than they've ever done before.
Right.
Yeah, I think when it comes to innovation, we have this kind of dichotomy of, on the one hand, we want to think of the blockchain and the underlying protocols as really just substrate, and everybody can build on top of them. And that, in some ways, starts to devalue what the innovations are underneath, but those are still very important, because if you make poor architectural decisions today and you make shortcuts, then you're building on top of a shaky foundation. Yeah. And so getting, even within Intel, getting some people through the thought of, yeah, we've had a few years of research in this domain. We've got this thing like POET, for example, of a completely different way to approach consensus. That's still valuable to get that out without trying to put some sort of monetary shackles around it. But we need to build on that kind of innovation.
How do you at Intel, Intel's participated in open source for a long time. Intel has deep expertise in a lot of areas, such as, secure enclave computing. And yet, I remember Bill Joyce saying, not all the smart people in the world work for you, and that's part of the value of open source. How do you get, and this could apply for any company, how do you get some of the developers who are proud of their skills to kind of check their ego at the door when they participate in open source?
I think it's, they get an audience to look at the good things that they've been working on. Yeah. But then I think pretty much anybody that's gotten up to that level has reached a level of maturity where they know to get that feedback. Until you've really tested your idea in the public, you don't know how strong it is, particularly for a security-specific feature. You really need to get that pounded on by the ecosystem. That was something that we were really excited to get out there. Like, we think this is a good idea. Go and pound on it. But we also want to make sure that that's responsibly conveyed. So for a very long time, for probably about a year that we had Sawtooth up, we had big scary warning signs throughout our documentation that probably were scaring people away, but we wanted to be clear, hey, this is experimental. A year's gone by, we're feeling that's a less experimental thing now, but people should be responsible.
In fact, there's an essay out there called Worse is Better that kind of sets a lot of the Unix philosophy kind of in motion, but it is that idea of you don't really know the quality of the ideas until they're out there and promulgated, and in some ways, something that's inferior, it stokes people up into becoming stakeholders to fix it, right?
Yeah.
Right. Have you seen that on the different Hyperledger projects that you've been involved in, or as Monax, right?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we were excited about when we joined Hyperledger was having a little bit more of a framework for not only collaborating, but hammering on ideas, as you were saying, Dan. because you can take an architectural decision or a code decision that is fine, and if you're a single company and you're operating your code base, you can take those decisions and maybe no one is going to question you, and that's probably the worst thing for your code, is to not to have things questioned, not to do the small things that make it easy to get more developers on board. One of the things that we found in cleaning up the code base to migrate it was that we had a lot of small cleanup here and there that made when we looked at it after we had done all that cleanup, we realized that it was a much more approachable code base, which allows us to get more community involvement. And so the idea of moving it into Hyperledger or an open source project AirSDB had been open sourced all along, but it was in our namespace rather than in a collaborative namespace. And moving it over to a collaborative namespace made us step our game up, which I think was incredibly important from a maturing point of view.
Makoto, Iroha it started out, and I'd say it's largely still being used by Asia audiences, even though I think there's going to be more pickup globally for it. But that's a community that is still also at the beginning stages of its kind of open source learning curve. So how, as a startup, and in a very challenging environment, have you had to sell the value of open source to organizations like conservative Japanese banks? And then have there been any examples of them actually feeding back and wanting to become contributors to the project?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think a lot of people in Japan already recognize the value of open source, mainly because of Linux. And Linux is actually used in many financial applications or by financial institutions right now. So that has already, in some ways, paved the road for what we're doing today. That being said, there's still a lot of people that, this technology is very new, especially blockchain technology. And so actually having open source is actually a requirement for a lot of these people, because if they can't see the internals, if they don't have access, it's really scary for them. So actually open sourcing is the only way to even get people to kind of look at what you're doing and working with you, I think, in some of these more conservative environments, which is kind of an interesting dynamic.
So it's become the new conservative rather than like proprietary software. It's like,
it's kind
if you're
of like
not open source, I don't trust you.
It's kind of like a backup in many ways. And so we've been working with some, in Japan, community building is very important. So we've focused a lot on our use case partner program, which is a program with our company, but it's a free program where we kind of do just free study sessions on mainly on Iroha software, but not only Iroha. And we try to discuss use cases, like what are some of the needs that people have and how do we solve it. And it's just kind of a free consulting in some ways, but it is about building a community and focusing on, how do we meet needs that the community has in the open source. So that we kind of take that as feedback and put it into the planning for what we do, and we create a lot of GitHub issues based on feedback that we get.
On Quorum, are you seeing like that bringing together people face to face and like having kind of engagement at developer conferences as a key way to kind of bring more developers into the Quorum ecosystem?
Absolutely. I think the pickup has just been explosive and a little bit overwhelming, especially for a team that it's really not our day job to maintain this thing. So I think one thing that has really helped is because we're building off of an existing open source code base, there wasn't as much bootstrapping of getting people up to speed, and so the contributions that come in are significantly more, they're very mature. Stuff kind of just runs. And we see contributions of like, oh, here's your .NET framework, or here, congratulations, Java runs on this, that we didn't necessarily even ask for. But where I think there's more struggle is the smaller bug fixes, enhancement requests, and where is this core roadmap going? There's still, I think, a tension between what is the roadmap, who controls the roadmap, which pull requests are going to get accepted. That gets into the nitty-gritty of the authority versus is this a decentralized or not project that I think we're still working through. even just getting over the concept of having a CLA on GitHub that you can click through to say that this is yours, to absolve JPM of liability if you contribute someone else's code. I mean, these are things that we've never done before. But I think that it's only been a few months, and I'm quite heartened at the progress that we've made, that we can even accept pull requests, because the day we launched it, we couldn't. So there is progress, and there is community, and there are commits coming in from around the world.
What about this idea, though, and open to the panel, of how do we evaluate the health of an open source community, right? And given that there are different concepts of how to run it, you could run it with the BFDL model, right? The benevolent dictator for life, BDFL, sorry, as kind of, more where it's like focused on a Linus Torvalds kind of thing. Or you could run it, let's say, more like the Apache style, which is to try to avoid the hit by the bus problem, which is where that's more shared. Both of these are valid models, I think, but both of them probably have some way of measuring whether they're effective or not. What do you think are some important metrics in that measurement of the health of an open source community?
Well, I think we have a lot of reporting going on across the Hyperledger projects. Mm-hmm. So, first of all, since everything's open source, everything is transparent. You can go in there and you can go into the GitHub projects, and you can see exactly what the commit activity is like. You can see our build process through our Jenkins servers, and you can see in the Sawtooth case, for example, you can see I think we're at about 85% code coverage with tests. That kind of rigor in process goes across this CII badge that we're working on with your new security maven,
yep.
Dave Huseby, and that it's self-reporting. So a project could make some very subjective decisions on that, but it's still clear if you go into that report what's in there. So there's all these sort of process things.
Yeah.
And then the other part is community. How diverse are these contributions that are coming in? And that's something else that's readily apparent if you go out to the projects.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the diversity of code commits is sort of the entry point for a lot of this if we're trying to measure it, as well as code coverage, documentation coverage, so that folks can get started. I think another metric that is really important at this stage of blockchain is, or the development of the ecosystem generally, is from the time that someone that has development experience learns about blockchains and would like to make contributions, how quick can they get to making a contribution? Mm-hmm. And there's no real way that you can actually measure that. It's definitely very hard to measure because it would depend on the developer, their background, and all of that. But to the extent that you can minimize that time and have a diversity of commits coming in, I think that you have a really, really healthy community as far as the benevolent dictator versus a no dictator for life. I think that is. It kind of depends on where you need to go a little bit, as Amber was saying, from a roadmap perspective. And to the extent that you do need to have a little bit more centralized, I know that's a bad word in this conference, control over a roadmap, for better or worse, for whatever reason, then you want to lean in one direction. But to the extent that your roadmap can be a little bit more fluid, a little bit more dynamic and responsive, then you can lean in the other direction.
Where should we, I don't know if you had other comments on metrics or thoughts?
Well, I think just kind of spontaneous pull requests with new features is one interesting thing. Like one day someone came and contributed TypeScript library for JavaScript for Iroha JavaScript SDK, and that was just, wow, that came out of nowhere, but they kind of rewrote all this in TypeScript. So things like that are kind of nice to see as far as progress.
Yeah, I think that for projects that are started by a single entity, feeling even just amongst the community when that kind of branding drops away and the platform or the product tends to stand on its own and people stop referring it to by somebody's something, but just the something, then it kind of is becoming its own thing. And I think that comes along with hopefully some contention as to what you should do next. And the reason that you have that feeling of authority or centralization around the roadmap is that different people want to do different things. And that means that they're waiting for those features, or they're starting to take ownership, over that project and want to see it go in a certain way. And I think that that kind of discussion and argument is incredibly healthy to evolve the best kind of product.
Staking, getting that sense of ownership, that stakeholdership, is really hard, right? A lot of the projects at Hyperledger will have one or two companies that are clearly banking their businesses on it, right? Which can make it easy for people on the side to say, well, somebody else will handle like the hard work. And if I have a bright idea like TypeScript support, I'll throw that for JavaScript, I'll throw that in. But how do we pull more developers in? How to get them to like really get into the internals and take a sense of ownership, you know, to the degree where if they see a release about to be made that has a major issue, that they actually will stand up and veto that release. Like that sense of co-ownership. Like perhaps you've seen on other projects or things that we could be learning from.
Yeah, well, I think I mentioned this when we were having a kind of a smaller dialogue over in the Hyperledger area. But we've had some of our most ardent users of Sawtooth come in and really not be so concerned about being involved in the development of some of these infrastructure pieces and not necessarily wanting to share with us exactly what they're doing with it, because for them, they are starting to stake their business on that infrastructure layer. So sure, when they see a problem, then they're the first ones to jump in and say, hey, you got a problem here, you need to fix it, or we're going to help you fix it ideally. Right. But as they are staking their value on it, then you know they have that vested interest, and it's kind of interesting to see that come along, because these companies are ones, I won't name them, but they just kind of come out of the blue. Right. And here they are, and it turns out they've been working on something in the dark for 3 to 6 months, yeah. and now they need a new change.
Yeah. We've had very similar experiences where you're push a release or you're about to push a release, and all of a sudden someone comes out of nowhere, and it may be a big company or a small company, but it's definitely a user. They definitely have been, they're not an entry-level person, and they say, wait, there's a real problem here. And I think this creates kind of a tension where sometimes you can get a problem where someone will be invested in your code base and will submit a fix for whatever the problem might be. But the tension exists then after that, because after that, then it is typically then back on the one or two sort of predominant companies of the code base to make sure to maintain that feature or that fix. And that is a little bit of a management in terms of how do you sort of direct from a strategic level rather than a tactical level the development of your code base, and what can you as a single company accept, or as a single maintainer or even set of maintainers, what can you accept in terms of workload, and there's always a finite ability of development cycles. So
I think sharing a strategic roadmap for the future, like the vision of the project that you want to have, is very important. I really hate design by committee. I really think there needs to be some kind of design dictatorship in order to have a good, clear vision. But the implementation of that should be completely free, and there's many, many possibilities. And the people involved should be, should see this vision, see, oh, this is what we want to create. Well, that's a good vision. Let's do this. Or if they have a differing opinion, they should say, no, it should be this way. But having that type of forum is very important. So we try to do that through chats, like on Gitter or Rocket Chat. We need to use Rocket Chat more. But that's one way that we try to share at least some of the milestones that we're working towards, so people can see, oh, this is the type of project we're building.
I think there's a difference between the open source project proper or itself and the ecosystem of tools and software that surrounds that allows the entire thing to exist and run, especially within enterprise. And so what we're seeing is a lot of client-driven, like end-user client-driven questions coming into tech vendors, asking them, do you support Quorum, for example? And then them saying, well, sure, we can download the platform, but what would be really good is if we could deploy this more quickly to this specific Linux image, or we want to support this VM, or we want to support this kind of container. And so there's a bit of a necessity is the mother of invention thing, where you do end up where things might get built twice, or they might kind of all lump around DevOps at first, or it's a little more organic than if we said, here's the roadmap, and then centrally planned the whole thing. But again, I think that kind of competition is a little healthy. And it also hopefully creates a bit more of a marketplace where you're not going to a single vendor for a full stack solution, but you've got some core kind of platform, or even as low level as a protocol, and then an entire ecosystem of services that it depends on what you want to implement, how you want to approach architecting it, hosting it, and supporting it. And there's actually more than one way to do that.
Right. So the phrase "designed by committee," hits me right here, right? You could also say "designed by hash rate." You could also say, right, "designed by stake" or whatever. But one of the tough questions I think for this community is answering kind of the broader industry's concerns about the pace of change, right? And the concern if I'm going to build, a system for tracking assets and promises whose outcomes might, contracts whose outcomes might take a year to materialize, how do I keep up with that change? How do I know that I'm actually betting on something that'll still be supported and around in a year, that sort of thing? And while I try to set expectations like build your first to throw away, and anticipate that anything happening soon will have to be re-implemented, what are things that like the developer communities could think about? I mean, let me put it this way. Are we at the right pace of change with our different stacks? How should we be managing expectations of the users about what seems like a lot of churn? And are there techniques that we can do to try to avoid too much legacy from holding us back in what we want to build?
Yeah, so we did our kind of build the first one and throw it away thing last year, where we had taken code that was largely from research, and then we put it directly into POC projects. And that's how we found out what stuck and what didn't stick. And we went through kind of a painful process at the end of 2016, taking everything apart. We had all the parts on the floor and putting it back together. And so we've got something now from a Sawtooth perspective that we think is the future that's going to be stable moving forward, stable APIs, stable structure.
You're about to release a 1.0.
Yeah, we're getting close to a 1.0 this summer. And something that was important for us, thinking of our users that might be, rolling their first to throw it away or not, there was a couple things that were really important to carry forward. So blockchain has some very unique features, and one of them is that you need to have, or you get to have, agreement across participants that don't necessarily trust each other. And something that's important for us to maintain that, even as you take this technology into a closed enterprise setting, is to maintain that Byzantine fault tolerance. So we made sure that as we architected in and adapted the consensus API, so we can plug in a crash fault tolerant or a Byzantine fault tolerant, something that handles forking like a Nakamoto consensus or something that provides absolute finality. There was still always support going to be there for Byzantine, because that's something I think is important, that we close our eyes to a little bit on the enterprise side, to think, well, everybody's permissioned, so there's not going to be any bad actors in there.
I think it's,
There'd be
why
plenty.
else are we blockchaining if we're
Right.
not Byzantine,
Yeah.
from my point of view? Yeah, we've taken the car apart 3 times, I think, and we were very early in the game, so we had a little bit more time to take the car apart, I think. And one of the ways that we've tried to abstract that from our user perspective is to have kind of a clear separation in our mind of tools versus runtimes. And from a runtime perspective, we needed to make sure that, frankly, we had contracts with our users around a couple of interfaces. And besides that, we had our tools that could abstract the rest of the mechanisms. And we made no guarantees with our users outside of that. However, we haven't really had big complaints, because the 2 important interfaces for us, as long as we kept to those, most people had no problem building their applications, upgrading their applications over time, and maintaining those. Not forever. We're still pre 1.0, but for a significant amount of time.
So API stability is very important, and the way that we're handling that right now is we're actually taking a step back. We're starting to move towards 1.0, and to do that, we're actually restructuring things a little bit. We're creating microservice architecture, kind of taking the pieces that we have and putting them in a more modular setting. And as part of that, we're kind of sitting back, designing, what kind of system do we want 2 years from now, 3 years from now? And what's the plan? What's the vision? What kind of API are we going to need? What's our data model going to be required? And from that, we're kind of working back and saying, this is the API we can have now, and it's going to be stable for all these use cases for the next 2 years, so or whatever. So that's the type of process that we're doing. And actually, we spent the last 4 weeks just doing only design, really. We've done a little bit of development as well, but most of the team has been focused on design and trying to take a step back and saying, what should we be working on? We do a lot of this design proposals on the wiki, and we use Confluence a little bit as well. So it's kind of trying to work out together with the community on, what can meet everyone's needs.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that, I'm going to approach the question a little bit differently, I think, because this is one of the questions that kind of keeps me up at night. And that's because from a business standpoint, we run a lot of risks of how many, how frequently, how much of pilots or POCs are you engaging in. And you can tell management as many times as you want that 4 out of 5 of these are going to fail, and that's how it's supposed to be. No line of business wants to be those 4. They want to be the 1. And that's just not going to happen. And when you look at market infrastructure, we can put as many beanbag chairs and foosball tables as we want. It's not agile. Imagine if everything magically had been ported over to one of these systems a year ago and was running in production now, and we had dropped the 10 to 20 million plus that it's going to take to truly deploy one of these things. And then it turns out that actually, with some iterative change that's happening in quite an agile way behind the scenes, because this emerging technology is actually emerging before our eyes, that it could have been done better if we just had tweaked this other thing over here. And now it's a BAU process, and you're baked in, and it's going to be forever to change this thing. So I think the pressure that we're experiencing specifically within the financial industry to get there more, better, and first, ultimately could be a bit of a detriment if you're building to yesterday's technology. And you're baking in design considerations, to your point earlier, for things that we're imagining better ways to do all the time.
Yeah. I want to open the floor up to questions from the audience. Feel free to kind of raise your hand. I think we have a floating mic around. If anything that we've talked about so far is, we don't have a floating mic, but we can just yell out and sound guy in the back going like that. But feel free to stand up, and I'll try to recognize you and ask a question. If not, I have a few more. So one of the, here we go, right in the front, the second row. Could you stand up and
Repeat the question.
Sure.
Yeah.
You mentioned the difference between the value add work that's getting done on top versus the infrastructure layer where there's a lot of the open source. I wonder if you could comment on what do you use to build those layers of the value add on top?
Do you want to repeat the question? Do you want me to?
Sure, go ahead.
I think the question was, we've talked about the value add layer on the top and the infrastructure beneath. What tools do we use to help distinguish between the two, help build?
Yeah, what do you use to build? What are those
Like
value
specific
add?
IDE SDKs?
Examples maybe of what you mean by that, and what do you use to build that stuff?
Sure.
And how is that different than the open source?
Okay.
For example, Composer
Right.
is an open source tool for building applications. Would you consider using that, or are you using your own tools that are different than that?
Well, specifically for Quorum, we're using things that support Ethereum-like ledgers. So one option is Cakeshop, which is an IDE SDK that's Apache licensed. You can build whatever you want in it. Another option is the Truffle development suite that also supports a lot of public Ethereum projects. Both of those allow you to test and deploy smart contracts and build things in ways that are visual that you would be used to, do network monitoring. But the applications that you're building within those do not necessarily become part of the same open source project, in the same way that doing graphic design in GIMP doesn't mean that your image now has to be open sourced, or a book that you write in Microsoft Word, Microsoft now owns. So what you create out of open source software can still be its own bubble.
I think we really are at the Emacs versus VI level, though, of development tools in this space. I mean, I think
So like
it's,
cage match time. It's like very serious opinions.
no, just
Yeah.
text mode
Right.
to some degree, with
Yeah,
a
yeah.
little bit of graphics here and there. And I think that's a place that will pick up quite a bit. I hadn't heard of Kshop. That's interesting.
JP Morgan released that one too, so.
Yeah. That's cool. I think about it actually outside of the tools perspective, and what is it that you're going to be building on? Blockchain is essentially a database. You're going to be building on what kind of data is available to you in that. One of the anti-patterns that we see as this technology goes into enterprise is, it's a Byzantine fault tolerance. That's a hard problem. Let's kick that off. And then the other one is we're not sure how to deal with confidentiality of the data and privacy. So let's sidestep that problem by we'll just put some opaque receipts out into the ledger, and then you don't really have to worry about it because we'll all have separate ledgers off to the side, and then you've recreated the problem that we're all trying to solve with blockchain. So with Sawtooth, we maintain state. So you can think of state like database schema. What kind of facilities are available to you to build on top of and still get access to that data and use this as this new kind of database that we're all excited to use.
Yeah, the number of times that I've said you do not need to reconcile to the blockchain, that's definitely a concept that people come up with a lot, is let's just keep everything off-chain then, and then we'll just all match it somehow. But I completely agree, and I think that informed the design decisions for Quorum as well, is making sure that it's truly robust, decentralized consensus, but keeping this kind of concept of private smart contract execution was the entire MVP that was, if that hadn't been possible, there would have been no product there. And now with the zero knowledge layer that we're thinking about on top of that for the settlement piece, I think it's a privacy focused product, but blockchain at its core is still an information security product. Mm-hmm. And so I spend most of my time trying to sit with the business and thinking about how those things will change, because if you're not solving business problems, you're probably in the wrong place. But if we do that, if we're doing that right, and at the same time making the right technology design decisions, everything else that I think the middle office pieces that were constantly being sold, we're going to drive down middle office costs, we're going to eliminate reconciliation, we're going to just lower the ops overhead in general, I think that falls out of it. You have better business practices built on better technology. The middle office is there as this kind of brute force engine that supports those two things as it is. So we can kind of slice those margins down, offloading more. But if we get that tech piece wrong, it feels like the ops piece is going to continue to just be a complete quagmire.
Other
Just
questions?
my opinion.
Yeah. So I've got one. Actually, playing upon that, do you think that eventually, okay, so a lot of people are building first of their kind of blockchains for particular industries or use cases or situations. Do you think eventually we get to kind of templatized smart contracts in this space and business logic, whatever, for these? And is there a natural inclination for people to work together on those, or a natural inclination for them to be, everyone's a snowflake, everyone's got their own kind of terminology? Like, does that converge or diverge, do you think?
I'll just start by saying I think we're really going to see a lot of common use cases covered in core transaction types in the various systems. So there'll be some kind of core functionality that will cover maybe, 80% of the use cases out of the box, and the remaining 20% can be rewritten through some template library or eventually some kind of plugins. So I think App Store is a good analogy. So on the your phone, you have different apps that you go and you download from somewhere and you plug it in. So I think eventually everything's going to be moving more in that direction.
Okay.
I would take a little bit of a different perspective, and based upon the question, I think that it's kind of important to understand what one means when one says smart contracts. And I think that a lot of people that might be coming from maybe the Ethereum style would view smart contracts as a random script. And so then it becomes a question of what is that script actually doing for you as an application. application maker? Is that formulating an agreement? Is that defining an asset? Is it providing a role-based access control? The whole spectrum of things that people are doing in terms of application building, all of those need scripts. And so I think that we will see, on the one hand, a convergence towards plug and play in terms of low-level application modules. And then I think we will see a divergence in terms of IP being the one thing potentially, if you are a blockchain or smart contract company and you don't release a public application, you still have to make money at the end of the day. And a lot of what we're doing in blockchain very much challenge the business model of traditional open source companies, and potentially smart contract sales or licenses is one avenue of monetizing.
I think that we see, especially in financial services, this is one of the classic, like, sure, you want standards, I've got plenty, pick one. That it's going to be very hard to enforce standards upon people, but if you're using open source standards, there's a much better chance that your applications are going to get pickup and be able to plug into the same ERPs, to start using industry lingo. But across all of the different sorts of pieces of middleware that right now speak the same thing, the less that we have to kind of change those, and the more we can select which ones are working right now and which ones would we want to double down on, probably better than having to, anytime you go back and you tell people, in order to use our software, you have to remodel everything in this specific proprietary data model or APIs. It's a barrier to entry for your product. And so I think some of the microservices and APIs pieces are picking up, but it really behooves us to collaborate across the industry on some coalescing around some open standards as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I think thinking of it as, what is it meant by industry? Like, if we think of blockchain as the industry, or do we think of fintech? Because one of the things that we've seen a lot, I'd be kind of interested to hear what CoinDesk comes out of this conference with. That my perception last year was that it was very substantially fintech here, and I'm running into more and more supply chain IoT kinds of interactions this year. And I know from just interactions with Sawtooth POCs, this is a big swing towards or increase of supply chain going on right now. And so the kinds of smart contracts or transaction logic, business logic that you would have in moving securities around is going to be probably quite a bit different than showing traceability of like an aircraft part, for example. And I think we see that on the Hyperledger board too with, we've had Boeing on, but now we
Airbus.
just recently had,
Airbus.
Daimler.
Yep.
Daimler joining. Maybe Boeing will join soon. Maybe I'm pre-announcing for them and they don't know it.
Boeing's in the room, see me after.
But there's a lot of industries outside of the financial arena who I think were wise to see this first, because with Bitcoin there was obvious correlation with monetary instruments. But
Well, it's all money at the end of the day, right? It makes it work around. Thank you very much to my panel. Why don't we stand up?
yes.